The first thing that I wanted to do before jumping into really trying to address the transmission tunnel was start to take some measurements on the engine and trans setup. Mostly I wanted to get the engine mount bracket to the front of the bell housing, the total length of the transmission from the bell housing to the shifter, from the shifter to the widest section of the transmission, which is right here, really pretty much where this bolt lands. This is about 10 inches wide, accounting for that bolt all the way to the outside. So that should cover everything from the front of here to the back of there. So that is about a 5-inch section, 10 inches wide. This here in the middle, sort of the waist, if you will, is 8 inches wide, and that's the most narrow section of the transmission. So taking measurements from the shifter to the widest, from the shifter to the most narrow, bell housing to the most narrow, and basically drew up this here diagram. And no, no, that is not what it looks like. Basically, this is supposed to be the engine. I drew the little engine mount here on the side, and obviously this is just kind of a very rough mock-up of what the top-down view of the transmission is supposed to look like. So if you're doing this swap, I recommend taking some of these measurements yourself. The engine mount, bell housing, length of the transmission, shifter to the widest, shifter to the most narrow section, and the total widths of the narrow, the width of the widest, maybe even the total width of the bell housing. And so before we jump right into addressing what I've got going on under here, let's dive underneath the car and we'll take a look at some of the marks that I've left and how basically I am going to be notating the underside of the car to give myself a reference for whenever I go to do the hammering and the pressing and all of that.
Alright, and here we are. I'm just going to show you guys some of the marks that I have already made. This is my L1 plus L2, which for me is basically the total length from the engine mount to the shifter on the transmission. So this is going to run all the way up, just about dead center in terms of, you know, where the shifter location is going to need to be. So that's just more of a reference point than anything. And then if we move over here, I've got L5 and L6. So L5 is the widest point of the transmission, and so it's basically right along the line of this seam sealer, which kind of sucks, but again, it's not really a big deal. And then L6 is just the total width of that widest section. So this is the distance from the shifter to the front of the widest section, and then from here back 5 inches is the total actual length of the widest section of the transmission. So one of the things I'm going to have to figure out is how much work am I going to have to do here and here to make sure that the bell housing of the transmission doesn't make any contact here. Now, what I can probably do is just take the location of the engine mount and take the measurement from there until where the bell housing starts to narrow down and use that to figure out if I need to actually smash these in. I've seen a lot of people end up doing both sides, and I don't know if I need to do that, but at the very least I'll probably end up doing some on this side just for the turbo downpipe, or the exhaust downpipe that comes right off of the turbo will need to sneak its way down under here to connect with the rest of the catback exhaust. So let's talk a little bit about how I plan to widen this out.
So this is the plan. It looks a little bit jank right now because I just kind of threw it up there just for the sake of showing you guys kind of what I'm trying to do. Obviously, like, I'm gonna have this set up better than what it currently is because this jack is currently all diagonal and wonky. But the idea is any of the, you know, sort of standard scissor lift type jacks that come in the trunk of just about every car these days, you basically are going to try to wedge that into the top of the tunnel, and as you crank the pin on the end, to what would normally extend the jack to help stand up your car, this is actually going to press outward left and right against the inside of the transmission tunnel. And so this is significantly easier than just trying to take a sledgehammer to it, which I'll probably end up doing a fair bit of that, especially if I decide to do the corners, the left and right as well. So I'm gonna get this thing set up a little bit more not at a weird angle, and we're gonna see what we can do with this. So, I took the measurements off the transmission itself and marked out the transmission tunnel of kind of the areas that I would need to widen out, but there's probably a very good chance that I just take from the entrance of the transmission tunnel back like 10, maybe even 12 inches, and just go ahead and widen all of that out to where the top is widened from 8 inches to 10 inches across. It'll probably help fitting the transmission in whenever I go to put the engine and trans into place, and it's probably just best to not leave it up to exact detailed measurements, just because stuff's gonna move around. It's not gonna be placed exactly perfect. So let's see if I can't get this set up a little bit better, and we'll get to work. So what I'm finding is that the sheet metal that makes up the transmission tunnel is actually quite malleable, kind of stretchy. Basically, as I'm twisting and making it wider and wider and wider, whenever I take the pressure off of it, whenever I unwind it, it doesn't stay out. It has some elasticity, for an engineering term for you. But basically, as you are stretching it out, whenever you take the pressure off of it, it wants to stretch. It wants to relax back into its normal state. And so I think what I'm gonna have to do is basically stretch it past the actual width that I need, so that when it shrinks back and sort of relaxes, it doesn't just come all the way back to its original shape. So if I want it to be 10 inches wide, I may need to push it to 11 or 12, so that whenever it shrinks back, it ends up being 10, 10 and a half. All right, well, we made a small amount of progress, but really not a ton, so I've decided to switch gears. This is a pneumatic air hammer that I got from Harbor Freight, and I'm basically just hooking it up to the air compressor, and you can get this job done using that technique with just using that scissor lift, the scissor jack, and widening that out. But the timeline that I have, I don't really want to mess with it anymore, so I'm going with the big guns. Let's see what we can do. So here's what it currently looks like. It may not look like I've done a lot, but there's actually a pretty substantial amount wider than it was previously. So I've gotten all the way up here at the top to about 9 inches across, whereas it started about 8 inches total width, all the way up here at the peak. You can actually see a couple of spots, like this big sort of indentation here. That was from where I was using that scissor jack, and the top end of that, which is only about 1.5 inches wide, really squeezed in on one section there, but it's really not too big of a deal. I have already tried to test fit the engine in here, and I'm pretty sure that I have made all the changes that I need to make, at the very least, to get the transmission to fit. Now, KPower does recommend that you actually take this corner here, right where the sort of, the firewall meets down here, and sort of bash this upwards slightly. So basically taking this corner and trying to draw it up in for header clearance. So if you were using their header, if you're staying NA and you're not doing a turbo kit, their header needs a little bit of clearance down here. So they do recommend that you actually take this corner and bash it upwards a bit. I had to take, in order to get my CD009, which is wider than the stock transmission, so if you're using the stock BRZ trans, it's a little bit different, but I actually had to take this whole section here in a bit just so that the widest part of the transmission could fit through this slot and get back in there, just as it's, you know, kind of tipped down and feeding back in here as you're trying to slide the engine into place. Now, there's a very good chance that I'll probably end up needing to take this little corner here, see if you want to focus, this guy where it kind of comes out diagonally and then goes backwards. There's a little bit of a ridge. You can see I worked on that a hair with that air hammer, but I think I'm at the point where it's good enough to where the trans will be able to fit in here just fine. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just, because of how scratched up a lot of this stuff is, I'm gonna go ahead and come through and spray this with black engine enamel, you know, high heat resistant, and just to, you know, prevent any rust and all of that, and obviously, like, you know, getting that big bracket removed, you know, introduced a lot of area that probably needs to be painted as well. So we're gonna go ahead and come through, spray a bunch of this black, and then we'll see if we can't actually get the engine and trans dropped in. One of the other things that I went ahead and did that I knew I was gonna have to do eventually, but I was hoping I wouldn't have to do in order to get this thing dropped in, I went ahead and removed the barb that was here on the back side of this valve cover. Here it is, as you can see. So this was basically press fit, you know, like interference fit all the way back in there. And what this is normally intended to do when this engine is mounted transversely, horizontally in a Civic or an Acura or whatever, this guy allows you to release a lot of that crank pressure. It's that PCV, pressurized crank ventilation. And so basically when your engine is running, and especially when you're if you're running a turbo or any kind of boost, a lot of pressure is going to build up inside of the crankcase, and so that ends up inside of basically your valve train. And so in order to relieve that pressure, this was in place, and this had a line that would go, and it would recirculate back around, I believe, to the intake originally. Now, the reason that I removed this, and the reason that for the most part, if you're doing this swap, this is going to have to be removed, is because of the fact that when this engine goes into this car longitudinally, long ways, like a 2J or like an RB26 or something like that, this engine is intended to be mounted so far back towards the firewall that this barb would actually make contact back here. And if that's not exactly the case, there would be absolutely no way that if you retained that and tried to use it, that you could actually run a useful barb off of it to like a catch can or something. It's just this, and the back of the engine is basically going to be sitting right here near where these heater core inlet and outlets are going to be. And so that's why there are so many companies like K-Tuned and KPower even offers a modified valve cover that has a different release point. For example, KPower's has like sort of a banjo style dash 10 AN up here on the top. K-Tuned has one where there's two on the sides. I have actually already drilled and tapped two on the sides. Obviously you can't see them here, but that's where I'm gonna be running my catch can from. And so pretty much if you're gonna be doing this swap, that guy's gonna have to come off, and you're gonna have to find a way to plug this. This doesn't have any threads, unfortunately, so you can't just thread a bolt in there with some, you know, Loctite and just call it good. You might, if you wanna go the cheap route, buy some like epoxy, toss a, you know, cover a bolt in epoxy and jam it in there and wait for the epoxy to expand and completely dry so that that's fully plugged. That's one way to do it. What I'm gonna do is once I get this engine in here, this valve cover gasket is gonna come off, and I'm just gonna weld a piece of aluminum, because this is an aluminum valve cover. I'm going to weld a circular piece right there to basically just block that off. And then I'm going to be running those two -10 AN lines off the side to my catch can. But anyway, there's just a quick little piece on that. One thing I felt like it was worth mentioning was regarding the hardware that comes with the KPower engine mounts, and just kind of which of these bolts go where, because they say that the thread depths on all of these bolts match up with the depths of the holes, but yeah, it seems a bit ambitious to me. Oof. So through my trial and error and testing, this is the mount that goes on the driver's side with all of your accessories, and you're going to be using these 3 bolts here, 1, 2, and 3, and those are going to line up with these bolt holes, or with these bolts on the mount, like so. And you're going to be using, both of the M10 bolts will go on the passenger side of the engine, as in the exhaust side of the engine, and you're going to use both of those M10 bolts over there, as well as the longest of the M12. There's one similar to this guy in the middle, but it's actually longer than this. So this longest one that is remaining will go in this bolt hole here, because this engine mount has a standoff and the bolt needs to be longer to get through there. After that, you have the shortest of all of the M12 bolts here on the right side that goes in this hole, and then you have this middle one which has no shoulder, it has threads all the way down. That guy is going to go on the bottom left. Just felt like I should clarify that in case anybody wasn't exactly sure which bolts go where. And you want to be sure that the M10 bolts get torqued down to 35 foot-pounds and the M12 bolts get torqued down to 45 foot-pounds.
And so here is the job that I've done with painting all of this black. It's not my best work by far, and it's not pretty, but then again, it's not really supposed to be pretty. Nobody is going to be seeing any of this. I'm just trying to cover it up so that we're basically just trying to prevent rust here on the inside of the transmission tunnel. Now, engine mounts on, valve cover barb removed, transmission tunnel dealt with. Let's see if we can drop this thing in here for the first time.
Now, you may be wondering, hey, didn't you already fill this up with transmission fluid? This thing should probably be pouring gear oil out the back. Well, as you can probably tell here, the engine wants to stop swinging, I've got this rear transmission seal plug inserted into the back where the drive shaft would slip into. Now, normally, that all of your gear oil would basically just be pouring out of that rear seal. So, I'll have a link down in the description for a pack of these if you guys want to check them out. You basically should be able to find them at your local O'Reilly's, Advanced, Auto Parts, AutoZone, all that stuff. You can just leave your transmission empty, get it all mounted up, and then fill the transmission once it's mounted in place, but that can be pretty difficult just with where the oil needs to go in on this other side, where the oil fill plug is. So I didn't really, I just went ahead and did it. I didn't even really think about the fact that it was gonna pour out until the first time I tried to lift this up, it started dumping out. So I topped it off, put that plug in there, and we're good to go. Let's see if we can get this thing in. And so this is one of the main reasons why that little hose barb needs to come off, because it lands right here, and there's almost no way that you would actually be able to drop this in with that thing on there. And even if you did manage to get the engine in, there's no way you could actually run a line off of that because of how close to the firewall it's gonna be. But we're pretty close, but as you can see, it's still on quite a bit of an angle here, so I'm gonna have to try and flatten it out a little bit more. Let's just keep going. I'm super excited for this to be in so we can really start moving forward and wrapping this whole thing up. So I added this here ratchet strap in order to basically So I've attached it here to the chain on the hoist, and I've attached it down to, there's a hole in the side of the engine mount on the driver's side of the engine. So basically what that's doing is basically trying to pull those 2 points closer together. Because this engine will be sitting on an angle, it kind of makes sense to go ahead and sort of pre-tilt it in that direction. In addition to that, I'm running into an issue with the water neck, or the coolant neck on the backside of the engine that comes from KPower, is interfering with the 2 lines for the heater core, which, you know, protrude from the back of the firewall, and that's what supplies your AC, well, that's what supplies your heat to the inside of the cabin. So I'm trying not to damage anything, but we're like this close, and it doesn't have anything to do with the transmission tunnel. Like, it seems like all of that is going to be fine, really no problem. I'm also interfering with, on the bottom, where the adapter plate for the transmission and where the bell housing meet, that section has to clear over top of the front subframe and the steering rack. And so I'm like trying to find this balance of how far can I push it back and not, you know, mess with anything on the firewall, but also like I have to push it back far enough so that I can be able to clear this down here. So it's getting a little tight, and I'm maxed out here on my leveler. I can't go, realistically, if I could get this to shift even further that way, then I would tip the engine, basically pull the transmission up and sort of drop the engine down. And that would help a lot, because then this adapter plate would kind of shift forward as it levels out. That number, I'm really starting to push up against this plastic cowl here near the top for where the windshield, or not the windshield, the hood comes down and seals across this barrier. Right here on this side, the windshield cowl, or maybe like the wiper cowl, is in the way. There's really no other way that I'm going to be able to push this back and also drop it down at the same time, because this guy's in the way. So what I'm pretty much gonna have to do is pull off wiper 1, wiper 2, get those out of the way, and then there's basically just a bunch of these little kind of pop clips all the way around that we're gonna have to undo, and then at the very least this top layer should come off, and hopefully that allows us to drop this down. So basically, once you have that, all the cowls loosened up, you've got 2 clips here on the left-hand side. There will be 1, 2, and then all the way on the right side, there's another one over here. And then you have those little square tabs that you have to squeeze from underneath and push up. Once you got all that done, this whole piece needs to slide forward so that it can come out, because it is wrapped up underneath the windshield. It's actually kind of convenient that I have these dirt marks, so that whenever I go to put my windshield wiper blades back on, I'll know exactly where they need to be sitting so that they wipe properly. All right, let's see if we can get this freaking engine in here. All right, so what I'm gonna try is taking my floor jack and rolling it underneath the transmission and trying to, because currently the engine and the transmission are sitting on an angle like this, right? So basically I'm trying to put the floor jack underneath the end of the transmission and tilt it up. Now what that's gonna do is, where the transmission and the engine meet, where that adapter is, by tipping it up like this, it's gonna shift that slightly forward. And it may not seem like a lot, by like an inch or 2, but that is pretty much all I need right now to be able to clear that, so that I can continue dropping the engine down. So here's hoping. I'm gonna try and do this very carefully and very slowly. All right, well, as you can see, I've pulled the engine all the way out again. Was really hoping I wasn't gonna have to do that, but there was just no way I was gonna be able to make that last like inch or so that I needed with this bolt stud in the way, which, as you can see now, is gone. Let's see if I can show you this guy here. There was another one of those right here, and it's wet with paint, so I don't really want to touch it. Basically, the coolant neck, this guy on the back side of the engine, was making contact with that stud, and I just could not push that back any further. And I believe that was the only other thing preventing the engine from sliding back further. Now, did I widen out the trans tunnel enough? It's anyone's guess, to be honest. But I'm gonna give this a couple more minutes to dry, just all this paint here. I basically just, this is the second coat of black touch-up paint that I've put on there, just because as I was like using my little hand saw to kind of file up and down, I scratched up a lot of this area as I was trying to get that cut off. So sanded it down a little bit, sprayed it with some black engine enamel touch-up paint, and now that bolt is pretty much flush. You can't even really see it protruding at all, which is exactly what I was trying to do. Give this a couple more minutes and we'll try it again. Well, it's day 4 of this, and we are so close, but unfortunately I think I'm gonna have to pull the engine back out. Let me show you guys what I've got. So what you might be able to see is that this side of the engine, the driver's side, lines up just about perfect with, if you want to focus, yeah, driver's side of the engine lines up almost perfect with that side of the engine mount. Come over here to the transmission, or the passenger side, and again, it's probably too dark, but basically we're good on that side, but we're failing on this side. And what I actually tried to do was just barely slightly drop this side down so that those 2 bolts on the Subaru mount would go into the bolts on the mount bracket, and then like continue to drop it down just 1/4 of an inch so that this side would sit down on those 2 bolts, and then I would just kind of shimmy it around until it went into place. But I tried that a good bit, but it just wasn't gonna work. So I think what the problem is now is that this ratchet strap I've been using to adjust the angle of the engine. So basically, as I tighten up this side, it tilts this engine further to the left, basically counterclockwise, if that makes any sense. And what I think the problem is now is that that is causing this side to be good, but that side to be bad. And the only way I can adjust that ratchet is by taking the tension off of it and loosening it up. And the only way I can take tension off of that is basically by pulling it back out, dropping it down, loosening it up all the way, and then starting from scratch. Also, this garage is freezing, hence why I have this big jacket on. I think it's, the outside temp is about 38 degrees, so maybe it's a teeny bit warmer in here, but it's 40 something. I got my little space heater over here running, and it's doing its best. It is trying to just crank away. Alright, so we jump forward here, and as you can see, the transmission is apart from the engine. Now, that's moving backwards. These were together, and I was trying to get it in the car. So why did I take it out and pull these apart? Well, as I was, going back and forth between working in the engine bay and underneath, and I was using my floor jack to lift the backside of the transmission up, I kind of just spent a couple of minutes thinking about how the transmission mount was going to work in the underside of the tunnel. In order to do that, I needed to remove this stock sort of bushing bracket here, this guy, and what I found was that this bolt was, I knew that this was missing because the bolt on the other side was there, but this one wasn't. But what I didn't realize was that that bolt was sheared off inside of the transmission body. And so at that moment, I knew I was going to have to extract that bolt. And so I figured, all right, well, let me just go ahead and take this bolt off, and then I guess we'll worry about that one. Well, in the process of trying to get this bolt off, it sheared as well. And the reason being, whenever I first took this off, now it's got a bunch of penetrating oil all in it, there was a ton of buildup in here, and you can actually see, if you look at the difference between these two, like this hole, which had the one that previously was sheared off, and then if you look at this hole, you can see the difference between the right one and the left one. This actually pulled some of the material of this, whatever, cast aluminum bracket, and actually sort of fused the bolt to that surface, which is a real bummer. And so now both of these are broken off, and I've got to extract both of these bolts. This is where I'm going to end this video. This is really, really disheartening. One, that it has set me back this far, and two, that I didn't identify this problem when I was prepping the transmission weeks ago, months ago. Really kind of disappointed in myself for not noticing that sooner, and then I've come all this way to basically trying to drop the engine in place. And even if I was successful, even if I got it dropped in, mounted up, at some point I would go to get, like, all right, now I'm gonna get the transmission mount bolted in place, and we're gonna get all that sorted out, and then I would have found this problem then. So maybe it's a slight bit of a blessing that I've identified this problem now. So yeah, that's where I'm gonna end this video. Not how I expected this to go or how I wanted this to go. This is probably going to be the last build update of the year. It is going to be the last build update of the year. I was really, really hoping that this was going to go a lot smoother, because I was hoping that I could get the engine dropped in, and then over the like 9 or 10 days until the end of the year that I have all of vacation. So I'm just gonna be at the house grinding like from 8 in the morning to midnight to basically assemble the entire engine compartment, get all the coolant, all the wiring, all the fuel lines done. And then the goal was to have the first startup for the engine before the end of the year, just to have like a milestone. But here we are, you know, things happen, delays happen, parts go on back order. It's just part of the game, but it is kind of disappointing. I was really hoping to have at least the first startup before the end of the year, but at this point, with needing to extract these bolts, and who knows how long that's going to take, might have to put a torch to it, heat it up. Yeah, this sucks. But it's part of the process. You know, this is a year in the making, and I can't believe that I've only gotten this far. Like, thinking back on the last 12 months, whenever I first got my first box of KPower parts in January, and I, you know, started working on this project, that it has been a whole year, and I have only made it this far to putting the engine in place. Some guys have gotten their KPower kits, and within a month their cars are running. So feels bad. I mean, you know, everybody's got their own challenges and their own holdups, and life gets in the way, work gets in the way, family stuff, you know. So everybody's path is a little bit different. But I really was hoping that this was going to be done already. So anyway, trying to be positive, gonna get these bolts pulled out, but that doesn't necessarily change the status of getting the engine in place. But now that I had the engine out, it'll be a lot easier to change the angle, and hopefully that'll make it easier to drop it in place. But that's where I'm gonna end the video, guys. Hit that like button down below if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date. Hopefully see this thing run sometime early next year. And until next time, build your dreams.